Good morning and welcome to Glenwood Lutheran Church. My name's Pastor Mark Manning. I'm bringing you this video log today as we gather together during the very end of July here. Some hot, humid, and stormy weather. As we do gather and prepare to enter into August now, we will hear a lesson from Colossians, which we've been studying during this time of the summer. And Paul writes this at the very end of the third chapter of Colossians. He's speaking about Jesus and how the breadth of the gospel is so great. And he says that he says, quote, in this renewal, there's no longer Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, and free. End of quote. I want to focus on this for just a second to talk about this breadth of Christ's work and the way that he uses one particular word in particular. And he, of course, starts by speaking about contrasts. He contrasts two things that are very, very, very different to talk about how wide God's love is. He talks about, on one hand, Greeks, and on the other hand, Jews, whom he considers to be very, very different from one another, different cultures, different ways of thinking, completely different ways of dressing and acting. And yet he says the renewal in Jesus Christ encompasses both of them. And then he moves to yet another contrast. Those within Jewish circles would very much understand this, those who are circumcised and those who are uncircumcised. Amongst Jewish males, that was a simple way of dividing who was who. And it's obviously meant in a physical way, but it's also very much in a symbolic way. Those dedicated Jews became circumcised. There were lots of hangers-on, probably, who admired Jewish thought and who certainly the ethical lure of seeing the way that Jews conducted themselves, and maybe they even went to the Jewish synagogues, but they weren't circumcised, and so it was a way of talking about symbolically about those who were committed to the Jewish religion. And then there's barbarians, and he says, of course, from his perspective, a barbarian would be a stretch. And then he uses the word Scythian. And I want to talk just a little bit about Scythian. The Scythians were a nomadic, pastoral tribe of horsemen who lived in the area of what would be considered now southern Russia and the Ukraine, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And they invaded and bumped into the Greek Empire to the south and to the west. And they were considered complete pagans and barbaric pagans of the lowest form of humanity, if you could even call them that. And they lived nomadically, and they were a warlike. And now you have to understand that's in contrast to Greeks who lived in cities and who had a culture, particular culture, and were to greater or lesser degree agrarian and commerce oriented, not warlike. And the Scythians were regarded and came into contact with the Greeks in about the 8th century before Christ. And then really their influence waned by the 2nd century before Christ, but their name is still around as someone who would be considered the lowest form of humanity. And so Paul includes it in a list of describing symbolically of this is how far God's grace in Jesus Christ extends to barbarians and even to Scythians. Now, we don't know that he really means true Scythians, because they'd come to be a more assimilated toward with everybody else in the area then, but the idea still hung on. Finally finishes with slave and free, another interesting way of talking about contrasts. God's love in Jesus Christ takes in both ends of the economic spectrum: slaves on one hand, and the free landowners who owned them on the other. Well, as we gather, I hope you've learned a little bit and thought a little bit about the way that Paul talks about the breadth and the love of God, as we hear from Colossians this weekend. Take